Are you privileged? Some scholars say it depends on your answers to the following questions. Question one, if you need to move, are you pretty sure that you can rent or buy a home in an area which you can afford? Question two, can you go shopping alone most of the time? Pretty well assured that you will not be followed or harassed. Question three, can you easily buy posters, postcards, picture books, toys, and magazines and be certain that you will see images of people that look like you? I have a panel of experts today to help you understand what your answers mean. And author and activist Frederick Joseph is here for the big interview. His New York Times best-selling book, The Black Friend on Being a Better White Person, has the internet on fire. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
If you answered yes to any of the three questions I posed, according to feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh, you are the beneficiary of white privilege. 35 years after Peggy McIntosh's controversial article, White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, was published, writer and activist Frederick Joseph and Yahoo go next level with their 5-day privilege challenge. Designed to create anti-racist allies based on Joseph's compelling new book, this author and internet giant are asking millions of people a simple question. Do you know your privilege? Here for the interview is Frederick Joseph. He is an award-winning marketing professional, activist, and advocate. And did I mention New York Times best-selling author? Joseph is on the coveted Forbes 30 Under 30 list, and he is the author of the highly acclaimed book, The Black Friend on Being a Better White Person. Good morning and welcome, Joseph.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. So excited to have you here. Your book has the internet on fire. Your new campaign with Yahoo has everybody scratching their head trying to figure out if they're privileged. I have to tell you, I did the challenge last night. I didn't do it over 5 days. I just sat there and I did each day. And it was really, I felt like I learned something even about myself. I've been working in this area as a civil rights lawyer for years, but I think all of us can be reminded at any given point in time what our privileges are. So we're going to talk a little about the privilege challenge later, but I want to ask you about this book. The Black Friend book. It's received just rave reviews. What prompted you to write the book and why now?
Honestly, the book was written before the moment of the 2020 protests, right? And it came from a moment of microaggression and racism that I had been involved with. I was actually on my way to work one morning on the subway. And, for those who are, from New York, or familiar with New York, if you can get a seat on the subway, you take it as soon as you can get it, right? So I sat down in the seat, minding my business, listening to music. And it was a young white woman next to me. When I sat down, she clutched her purse, right? I looked at her confused. She got up and moved her seat as if I was going to do something to her. So that morning I actually tweeted about the experience, and many people said, well, I don't see how that's racism. What are you talking about? No one was harmed, no one was killed. And I realized then we don't do a good job of talking about the daily manifestations of racism, right? Microaggressions and things of that nature. So I took it upon myself to go ahead and have those conversations to help people better understand that this is happening every single day for people, especially who are non-white.
Yeah, what a simple but pretty profound experience that you had, and I know I've had it, and I can imagine that pretty much every African American person in the United States have had that or a similar experience where literally just your presence, just the fact of you being has caused some white person to feel uncomfortable. You look like a pretty, clean cut kind of guy. You don't look like you're on subways mugging people or snatching purses, but it had nothing to do with that. It just quite simply was the color of your skin. But I want to ask you, there's a lot of talk, particularly by activists, about it not being the responsibility of African Americans to teach the oppressor how to correct their behavior. So have you gotten any of that feedback? Because your book is really a guide for white people to teach them about those kind of microaggressions that you just talked about.
Well, I think the interesting thing is I actually say that in the book, right? It's not up to not just Black people, but any group that's oppressed to have to navigate their trauma to teach oppressors. But I do think that it's important to have these conversations when you can, if you are willing to. So for me, I'm very direct about that. And I think the book honestly is not just for white people, though that's in the subtitle. I think the book is for everyone who needs to develop themselves in anti-racism, right? Anti-Blackness is perpetuated by more communities than just white people, and ingrained self-hatred, ingrained white supremacy is also perpetuated by our own community, which I've seen a ton of feedback from Black people saying I've also learned from the book, and they didn't realize I was helping uphold some of these issues that you're talking about.
Yeah, you language is very important in this book, and how things are framed. Like, you make the distinction between an accomplice versus an ally, an anti-racist versus an empathizer. Why is language and how we use language so important in this bigger conversation about privilege?
Well, I think language is important because it's the connective tissue of us all, right? Whatever we're trying to get across, it's important that we do so with intent. A good friend of mine, Mickey Kendall, who's the author of the New York Times bestselling Hood Feminism, actually had said this on Twitter one time. She's like, we don't need allies, we need accomplices. And it just kind of sparked something in my mind, right? Like, she's so right. We need the people who are in the mud, the people who are getting dirty with us on the road to change. Looking back at the summer of 2020 and people posting black squares, ultimately those black squares were a performative allyship that didn't actually create any systemic change, versus the people who are actually saying, I'm going to use my resources, use my access, use my privilege to influence real change for this community that I'm claiming to care about. And that's the distinction between the two.
Yeah, I can remember one of our producers who's a Gen Z, I guess she is. She's younger than a millennial, talking about the whole black square, phenomenon that was happening on Instagram, and how some people were being attacked because they were posting the black squares, and others were being attacked because they weren't posting black squares. So, a lot of people were confused about, what do I do in this moment? So books like yours help people who are really struggling with, how do I participate in this anti-racist movement and not have my efforts assailed or attacked because, I'm not, quote unquote, sufficiently woke. I want to talk about how you approach this book, though. A lot of books written about how to be an anti-racist or anti-racist book, a lot of them chronicle, the historical journey of African Americans from slavery. You talk about some of those historical moments, but you really go in terms of your personal stories, and you get pretty vulnerable. You describe some pretty cringe-worthy experiences that happened to you during high school. Tell us what it was like, being that open about your own personal experiences.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, but as I said in the book, if I offer my experience, will then someone offer empathy and ultimately change, right? The reality of it is the writing of the book was somewhat cathartic and healing for me, because I finally got to confront some of my oppressors where I wasn't able to do so as a 16-year-old, as a 15-year-old, an 8-year-old even experiencing racism. So for me, it was important to talk about the fact that, yes, we have experienced slavery, we have experienced Jim Crow, we have experienced segregation, but there's a through line from those moments directly to the moment that we are in now, right? January 6th insurrection doesn't come from nowhere. It has an underlying white rage that's rooted in all these microaggressions that I'm talking about. And if we do a better job of talking about that, then maybe we avoid and ultimately change some of the things that are happening right now as we live and breathe.
Yeah, some of the examples you use, that happened to you as a teenager really resonated with me. I have 3 kids, and I'm talking with my kids about, your book and some of their own experiences, like you saying that, some of your white friends would ask you what hood you lived in, jokes about your mother making fried chicken, assuming that you were, interested in going to the NBA or that you could dunk a basketball. A lot of those stereotypes that are unfortunately associated with African Americans. How did you navigate that as a 15, 16-year-old? Because that could be pretty difficult territory.
Yeah, I mean, it's still difficult territory, honestly, right? Being in any space where you are meant to be othered, where you are the oppressed, and there are a ton of oppressors around you, controlling not only the narrative, but also controlling the systems that you have to adhere to is never easy. But for me, I survived, right? And I'm hoping that my book will allow young Black and brown children to do more than survive.
But let me ask you this, Frederick. Did you survive by becoming the Black friend that your white friends, thought you should be? By becoming the guy that loved basketball and, liked to eat fried chicken and watermelon, or changed your language so that you could, sound hipper or more down or more hood or whatever the term would be? Is that how you survived?
For me, no. I think in some instances I leaned into, at 15, 16, whatever stereotypes there were, by not stopping the stereotypes, right? So while I was a dynamic person, I didn't lean into saying like, oh yeah, I'm gonna dunk the basketball, but I also didn't stop people from assuming that or step up for myself. And that to me, that's as much of an issue, actually leaning into the stereotypes themselves, which is why, I wanted to also write this book, because there are plenty of Black and brown young people and people who are not young who don't have the ability, because of said systems, to sometimes stand up for themselves, right? What do you do if your teacher is the one who's being racist and you're 14 years old? Right. So I'm trying to give a voice to those who may be voiceless in certain instances.
Yeah, you talk a lot in the book about accountability and people really having to embrace their privileges. That's obviously what the 5-day privilege challenge is designed to do, is to force folks to be reflective. So in doing this work and asking people to be reflective, is it correct to assume that you do believe that this racial division that we see that's so prevalent in today's society can actually be healed? Do you think that healing is possible?
I think so long as there are people interested in being better, healing is always possible, right? I'm a very transparent person. I think that there are some people who are so far gone that those are not the people I'm talking to, right? As I say in the beginning of the book, there's a ton of people who think that they are progressive, who think that they are liberal, and these people also need to be talked to, because racist manifestations, sexist manifestations, homophobic manifestations, transphobic manifestations happen even with the best of intentions on a regular basis. So this isn't a book necessarily for those who are supporting the most overt white supremacy. It's a book for those who don't even realize that they're being racist in general.
Yeah, so this isn't just for the insurrectionists on January 6th. So this is not their book. This is for the liberal person that's going to the BLM marches.
Right.
The person that, may live next door to a Black person and feel like, hey, I'm woke. I have a Black friend.
Right.
So are you speaking to those folks who say, I have lots of Black friends. I'm not racist.
Yeah, it's exactly that, right? It's the people who, if I come on for an interview, if I'm wearing a hoodie and a beanie, they look at me as if I have less intellect than if I'm wearing a suit, right? We're talking about a lot of things in here. We're talking about respectability politics. We're talking about false assumptions, false narratives, stereotypes, again, the daily manifestations of these things, because to be honest, many of the people even in that insurrection group are friends and family members of the people who are, friends with the Black person, right? So there's a lot of interconnectivity there.
Right. You use a lot of humor. We're laughing now. Obviously, it's a very serious subject, but you use humor, you use pop culture, a lot of references to, television shows, sports, teams, music, even video games. Why those references?
For me, I've always felt like the best teaching is done when people want to be taught, right? When people feel as though they can sit down, have a beer with you, hang out with you, people are more willing to listen. So I came off in the book as myself. I didn't, build a persona or anything of that nature. I said, this is who I am. I joke with my friends. If I can have you in my home and tell you I don't like what you just said, then I can do it in a book, right? It doesn't mean that I have to shame you ultimately, because I think the same thing happens for me. I was brought up and conditioned in sexism, conditioned in various forms of oppression. It doesn't define necessarily who I am. And I've had the ability to listen because people have been open, transparent, and honest with me, who love me and care about me.
In your research and you're thinking about this book, is it your understanding, one of our viewers has this question, that racism is a learned behavior? We talk a lot about how do people become racist. Little kids grow up, initially, and we see there's some commercial I think about, there was a white and black kid who are running towards each other and hugging and showing so much love and affection. And then the adults start talking, things change. So is that what you found too? Is that many of the folks that you're talking about, started out with a very, accepting, inclusive idea about the world, and it changed once they were influenced by others?
Well, I think that both respect and disrespect are learned behaviors, right? So I think that when people are born, there's a clean slate. You don't necessarily have conditioning yet, right? But it starts very early. It starts from the ages of 1, 2, 3 years old, in what I've found in research and my personal opinion. So I don't think that everyone's like, oh, I'm born and I love everyone around me. You have to be taught that the same way you have to be taught to hate as well. And that's part of the reason why in this book, I wanted to have an accessible conversation for people who are young, right? If you are 13, 12 years old, you can read this book as well, because oftentimes we are trying to combat oppression with people who are steeped in it for 30, 40, 50 years already. And that's a very difficult thing to do. If a kid can call me the N-word or touch a young black girl's hair in middle school, they can also learn not to.
Right. You have a chapter I thought was really fascinating called This Isn't a Fad, where you really talk about the difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation. For you, what are the differences in the two?
Well, I mean, the difference is simple to me. No one's culture or physical identity is a costume, right? It's not something that you can go out and do, right? I'm the example being blackface right now, right? I'm black. Black is not, I can't pull this off. It's my existence. Life or death, it's my existence, right? It is the mortal thing that I have to think about from the time I wake up to the moment I come back in this house. And seeing people take that and try to turn it into something for fun, something for, their own amusement is deeply problematic, because they don't understand what that actually entails. I mean, and even outside of, your complexion or your skin or race, you look at something like, let's use the example of a sari on an Indian woman, right? That is not, that's not a costume. It's someone's culture, right? It's someone's culture with a deep context and history. And therefore, you doing anything other than appreciating that from afar, frankly, is deeply problematic, especially if you don't understand said context. And you can't truly appreciate something unless you understand the history and context.
Your book is in some ways, Frederick, a call to action, and it's a teaching guide, it's a tool. What do you say about those everyday experiences that you talked about on the subway? I just had one myself. I'm in a line. I live in California. We have to stand in lines because stores have limited capacity. They can only let so many people in. So there are 4 or 5 people in this line. We've all been there for 15, 20 minutes. A white woman drives up, very expensive car, $5,000 worth of garb on, clearly from her bag and her shoes. And she says, "Oh my God, I just want to run in the store and make this quick exchange." And another guy in the line, a white guy, says, "Well, you can go through the back of you can go through the back door or the side door." And she said, "Okay, great, I'll just be right out." And she goes into the store, totally jumps the line and goes in. And by the time I get in, I say to the manager, "Hey, that wasn't cool. We've all been standing in this line. Yeah, I know she wants to return something, but I want to buy something. So what I want to do is equally important to what she wants to do." And the guy said to me, he said, "You are so right. This happens at this store all day long. Women like her come to the store believing that they somehow are, they've given some kind of privilege to jump the line." But he said he didn't want to say anything to her because this is the store that he works in and these are his customers. And he literally said to me, "You can say something to her." And I'm like, "Dude, I don't work here. That's not my job to police your line. I'm telling you as a customer, and is my money valuable to you and you want me to come back to your store?" So from your perspective, what do you recommend for people in these everyday microaggression situations?
Well, I recommend courage first and foremost, right? And that's not courage for non-white people, that's courage for white people. If you start to get it, it was up to that person to have the courage to step up and say something, because that entitlement that the woman had is only affirmed by the conditioning of other white people, frankly, and then oftentimes people who are non-white as well. It's generational. And unless people start talking to their friends, their family members, people online, right, then we're going to have it perpetuating through the end of time. Because your experience, while it's not unique for most of us, right, oftentimes it can be much worse than that, right? Like the way entitlement and white privilege works can oftentimes be life or death as a difference for us, right? So I think, again, it really is about people in oppressive communities, not just white, but anyone who belongs to an oppressive community, having the conversations and the courage to do the work in their community, right? If I worked at that store and a man had skipped you, let's say, because he felt like he could do so because you were going to do nothing to him, it is up to me then to tell him that what he's doing is deeply misogynist, deeply sexist, and to put myself in place to defend the right of you to not have that done, frankly.
Yeah, and for me as a Black woman, so in my mind, it's like, okay, I'm going to end up on a video, like going, crazy over being in a line. So I'm going to be your next viral video, or the police are going to be called and somehow I'm going to be deemed the aggressor in the situation, or I'm going to be put out of the store because I made a complaint. So all of these things are running through my mind as I'm so incredibly frustrated. And of course, I know what happened. I live in this frame. I understand it intellectually. I understand it, emotionally. But I felt powerless in so many ways after the guy was too chicken shit, let's call it what it is, to call the woman out because, he's more concerned about his sales and his profit than, what was the right and fair thing to do in that moment. I want to bring into this conversation now a young woman who's experienced exactly what we're talking about. She's had a transformation and realized the significant role of white privilege after she moved to an affluent white suburb. Welcome to the show, Sarah. Good morning, Sarah.
Hi.
So, Sarah, you've been listening to Frederick. You've been listening to this conversation. I know you've had similar experiences. You grew up, you said, in a very diverse neighborhood where race really wasn't, a big deal. You played with kids that looked like you and kids that didn't. But then you moved to this white suburb. What happened once you got to the suburb?
Oh my God, I felt completely out of place. And we lived in a huge house, which was not something that most of my friends had ever dealt with. Moving to Staten Island, I didn't even know that was an actual place. So moving there was a huge culture shock. But, I lived I was proud to live there. I was happy. I was like, wow, we made it, but it started to get iffy when I don't have anything in common with these people. The way that I feel about people in general, just like the human race, my counterparts were like just so entitled, as Frederick was talking about, where it's just like, I don't have to think about how I move. And that's not realistic from where I come from my world. And I'm white, like clearly I'm white, but it's, exhausting thinking and sitting here listening to the two of you talking, and I'm sitting here like nodding, and I'm like, this is such a problem. And people don't realize the day-to-day, making sure that you're not out of place, making sure that you're not talking too much and you're not out of turn and all of these things. And it's just been time and time again. I'm 35. So I moved to Staten Island when I was in junior high school. And year after year, it became more and more evident to me, and then I went back to college in Brooklyn, and I went to college downtown Brooklyn, and I was like, okay, cool. I'm amongst my people, I don't have to worry about anything because we're not really judging each other, and I dated a guy who was extremely dark skinned, and he was huge. He had like a football player like body, and we would be on the train together, and somebody would come up to me and say like, is everything okay? Is he bothering you? And I'm like, he's my boyfriend. Like, I love him. I couldn't even believe that this would be a problem. Maybe I'm bothering him. Did anybody think of that? Like, maybe I'm annoying him. Maybe I'm the annoying white girl that's like, wants to be around him. Maybe, who's to say? But it's just disgusting, and the only way to make this go away, and it's never going to go away because it is a learned behavior. You're taught as a kid that person is different or we're all the same.
Yeah.
So
I want to ask Frederick, listening to Sarah, and again, Sarah is, being very honest about her experiences going from a diverse neighborhood to going to an all-white community. Your challenge, Frederick, and you can talk now, tell us about this challenge, because it sounds like this is the perfect challenge for some of Sarah's, suburban friends that she encountered when she moved to that neighborhood.
Yeah, so the Yahoo Allyship Challenge that I've partnered with them on basically is 5 days of reflecting upon and taking action in your own privilege. And what I wanted to do was create something that holistically allowed people to first understand what privilege even is, right? I think that oftentimes we point fingers, we shame people, but a lot of times people don't even have an educational background in what we're talking about. Certain words in certain spaces, like white privilege. People are like, what is white privilege? If you grew up in an all-white space, then you would be like, I have no idea what that is. So in this challenge, we first look at something, for instance, such as taking stock of your privileges, right? And it's inclusive and it's intersectional because, as was said in the beginning of the program, we all have our own individual privileges, and it's not just about race. It's about gender. It's about class, religion, things of that nature. And then each day there's a new step to not only unpack and unlearn, but to understand. And then, talking about what actions can be taken if you simply want to be a better person, right? Like if you want to be a better person and a better person for the people around you, and they don't have to be huge actions such as going out and protesting in front of the police and things like that. It's sometimes as simple as using, that $5 that you have sitting around saying, hey, I'm going to donate this to an organization doing the work, and I'm going to make a monthly donation, things of that nature.
Right. I want to ask you, Sarah, did you ever talk to any of your white friends about this concept of white privilege, whether you use those words or not? I mean, like Frederick said, a lot of people don't, it's not a part of their vocabulary. But did you just ever, say to any of these white friends, look, you guys are treating these brown and black people differently?
All the time. And it's just something that just comes naturally. It's like part of my vocabulary. I have an advocating personality to begin with. So anybody that I feel like is underprivileged or, systematic oppression is a huge deal to me. Just you're a product of your environment and people don't understand that. So when somebody turns around and says, well, they should just get a job, or they should just get a job, or my tax dollars go to them, like hi, your tax dollars go to me too, because right now I'm unemployed, but that's okay because I look like you, and I don't get to turn that off. I don't get, it's just unfathomable to me that it's so ignorant. I look the way that I look. Not everybody has that privilege.
Yeah. Well,
to just walk around freely, and not being judged.
Yeah.
And the idea of like security guards walking around, like, I used to steal as a teenager. I used to steal, and nobody ever, like that, if that's not white privilege, I don't know what is. Do you know what I mean? Nobody ever
asked
me if I need help,
stopped you, or did anything to prevent you from engaging in criminal activity.
Never.
I bet
and like, I would walk into a store with my ex and he would be harassed.
Yeah.
So I could be stealing right in front of people and he would be harassed. And it's just like, constantly throughout the years, it's become more and more evident for me. But I take it and I say, okay, like, I need to diffuse this. There's some way, and it is having conversations with friends. And I've lost a lot of friends, and people are like, you're an N lover and this and that. And it's like, no, I just love people, and I don't understand where the separation is. I don't get it. So.
Well, I want to thank you, Sarah, for sharing your story, and continue to have these conversations, and get Frederick's book.
I will.
Send out copies to all of your friends. It's a perfect, go online, do the Yahoo challenge with Frederick, because it's a perfect way to, continue to have these really important and reflective conversations. Thank you so much.
Actually, my 14-year-old nephew is biracial, and he's also having issues similar to this with the touching of the hair. And I tried to convince my brother that his barber should be a person of color because his hair is not the same as yours. So even in my family, it's a conversation.
It happens in all of our families. Again, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your story. All right, before I bring on my next guest, it's Women's History Month, and we're doing Women's History Trivia. So don't Google this answer, but start posting your responses. Who coined the phrase white fragility? Was it Jane Elliott, Peggy McIntosh, or Robin DiAngelo? Now, again, you can post your responses. Don't look up the answer, because we're going to reveal the correct answer a little later in the show. Okay, so now I want to bring on some individuals who also have experienced this whole concept of entitlement. Joining me is award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker. She's an Indigenous and Black female bird watcher who says she knows what happens to Black people in the woods. Her name is Sandra Guzman. And also joining us is Steve Majors. He's an accomplished writer. He recently published an article in the Washington Post entitled, "I'm a Black Man with White Privilege." He says he sees how it distorts America. Steve is working on a memoir that will come out in the fall. It's called High Yellow. Good morning, Steve, and good morning, Sandra.
Good
All
morning.
right. You guys have been listening to Frederick. You've had your own experiences. Sandra, you said you wrote this article for a national publication after the incident involving Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in New York City, the whole bird watching Central Park incident that we all watched play out before our very eyes. You had a similar experience because you are an Indigenous Black woman that happens to be a bird watcher. So tell us about your experience.
Oh boy. So there isn't a bird that I don't worship. And moving to New Hampshire from New York City, and before that from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, nature, I was taught, is not something that's outside of me, that I am nature. And so on this particular morning, I go with a friend, an elder white man who introduced me to birding in New Hampshire. And we went to a state park on the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And this is an extraordinarily beautiful park. It's hundreds of acres that are now private lands. At one point, they belonged to an industrial billionaire of the last century. And so there's still homes, private homes in this park. And so we're approaching this, he points out to a family of woodpeckers. And the tree where these birds are nesting are across the way from a small house. And so we're approaching, I'm in awe of these woodpeckers just pecking away and the family feeding each other. And I'm just, in total bird joy. And from the side of my eyes, I see a white woman, we call them Karens now, approach the window and, took a look at us. And I'm still just in awe of this family of birds. And a few minutes later, a cop car comes by. And so this white older man is surprised, that there's a cop car in this park. He's been birding for 50 years and he's never experienced this. And I asked him, have you ever been birding with a Puerto Rican, with a Black person, with an Indigenous person in an allegedly white space? And so for him, it was a shock that there was this cop. And so I wasn't arrested and I wasn't questioned, but I got the look from the cops. And if you're a non-white person who has had the look from the cops, you know that they're checking you out, trying to see if the binoculars that I was holding was a gun. And it was a very disturbing experience, but I didn't let it really get to me. And we talked about the experience and I kept moving and I forgot about it until the Amy Cooper incident. And I wanted to write about it because when we use public lands and also, when we go to malls, when we have the bodies that we have, we're constantly negotiating the space that we walk in because we understand that the systems have been in place since the 1492, since the 1500s when the ships arrived. And so I thought it was important to talk about it, to talk about what happens when there is an assumption that we can just go into any public space and be okay with it when we have a history that we carry in our bodies. And so we know better to just go in there and not go into a park, go by myself without really understanding the dangers of it.
No, absolutely. I want to bring Steve into this conversation because Sandra mentioned negotiating space. And Steve, you know a lot about negotiating space because in your article, you talk about being biracial, having a white father and a Black mother, and being teased by your family in a loving way about your skin color being light and being bright, but then going out into the world and having your skin color mean something else and having to negotiate spaces. What has that been like for you as a biracial man who's thought to be really privileged or entitled in your family, but not so much so when you go out into the real world?
Yeah, I would say actually it may be a bit of the reverse. So, I grew up in a Black family. So my siblings, you would describe them as half siblings, but we consider ourselves brothers and sisters. We're all Black. I grew up in the Black community. I feel sort of immersed in Black culture. So although I'm biracial, I identify as Black, but it is clear to you, to the folks watching here, that I'm white appearing. My family never let me forget that I was no better, I was no different than any of them. And so, that really sort of imbued in me sort of a responsibility. As I got older, I think I was able to kind of put words to the sort of interactions that I would have out in the world and be able to describe that as privilege. So, as a child or, even as a teenager walking into a store, I could see the sort of reception that I would get. But when my mother would approach the counter, I saw how the dynamic would change. And I couldn't put words to it. And I think earlier you talked about many people don't have words for what white privilege is. It's only as an adult. I like the description that the feminist researcher Peggy McIntosh describes it. She describes privilege, specifically any kind of privilege, but white privilege, as sort of this invisible, weightless knapsack. And it's filled with special things, code books and maps and visas and tools. And those people who have it easily navigate the world in ways that others who don't cannot. And I know it to be true because I've benefited from those tools every day of my life. And so now as an adult with two daughters who are both Black, two adopted daughters who are both Black, I now see sort of the reverse of that. I see what it's like when I go out into the world and I see how the world treats them as opposed to how they would treat me. And it's heartbreaking to see what this does.
Yeah. I want to ask Frederick. Frederick, so Steve is talking about what we may call colorism. And he's saying that as a Black man who identifies as Black, but he's biracial clearly, when he goes out into the world because his skin color is brighter, lighter, that he's afforded this white privilege that typically happens for white people. And, and that was different for his mother, who was clearly Black, and now his two daughters who are clearly Black. Did you address that at all, in your research? How has that come up in terms of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so that's addressed actually directly in the book, not just in terms of people who receive privilege or lack thereof because of skin tone, but also proximity to whiteness. I think, oftentimes people have partners, people have friends who are white and then thus receive privileges even in that or lack thereof, right? I'm sure that there were times that Steve's privileges changed based on being with his mother, right? As opposed to being without her, as he said. So, I think it's a deeply important conversation because people don't realize, white privilege is so insidious and so strategic that it doesn't even just necessarily entail full white people, right? It's all about proximity, about being in a club, if you would, right? And this club is anyone who looks like us, anyone who might be more human like us, right? It's a like us club. And I think it's important for people to understand at a very young age because, as was put before, it comes along with all sorts of benefits and people reap the benefits of this as early as they are born, frankly, right? The moment that you get into elementary school and you go out into the real world is when it starts. It's not just about traveling. It's not just about jobs, careers, things of that nature. Sometimes it's as simple as I say in the book of being assumed to be the smartest in class versus being assumed where you live, being all these assumptions that come along with it. And there's not a way that we can not understand that starts very, very.
The proximity is interesting because I'm thinking back now to a friend group that I had, my husband and I, and there were 3 couples, so there were 6 of us, and one of the couples was a interracial, biracial couple. The husband was Black and the wife was white. So when we would go out, the 6 of us standing in a line, we would always tell our white friend to go talk to the manager because we knew if she went and addressed a concern about the line being too long, us waiting too long, us not getting the right table in the restaurant, she could get immediate results. And it was like, it became a part of the way we interacted in the world. Let's have Elizabeth go and talk to the manager. Let's have Elizabeth, and we would get free wine sent to our table, things taken off of our bill, moved to the front of the restaurant. I mean, things that, and the irony was, all of us were lawyers, doctors, super, super accomplished. I mean, you stack our resumes up to the sky. Elizabeth had not finished college, was the woman in the group who, if you're just measuring by accomplishments, it has nothing to do with her work. She's a wonderful, lovely, beautiful person. But if you're just measuring, how America measures people's success, she would be on the least successful of us all. But yet she had privileges that none of us, were conferred on us, despite all of our, demonstrable success. We had done all the things we're supposed to do: go to school, get a good job, have a title, blah blah blah. And here's Elizabeth, drops out of college, marries a Black ball player, and now all of a sudden she's getting us into the best restaurants in Los Angeles, getting us moved to the front of the line. So that allyship. And I know you talk about that, Frederick, in your book. And I guess, Steve, that's what you're saying. But you're saying that made you feel guilty. Having those privileges conferred on you wasn't like our group who we figured it out and we were like, okay, get us in that restaurant. But you were like...
It is. And what's scary is it's not just those everyday interactions, those microaggressions, but when you start to think about what the weight of that privilege does over time. So I can recall, like in colleges and in the workplace, when there would be managers, always white managers, who the pat on the back, the nudge along the way, the invites to dinners, the special sort of access to meetings. And I began to notice that there were people who did not look like me, who were not invited to them. So the weight of that privilege over time, you start to think about, like in institutions like, education and housing and employment and law enforcement, what that privilege does, every incremental privilege that people accrue over time, and how that allows them to go further and faster than everyone else. And that's really what's disturbing about it.
Yeah, Frederick, you're asking us to be reflective in your challenge about our privileges, whether it's education privilege or class privilege. But education privilege comes about because you do something. You have to go to the university. You have to get the degree. White privilege is different. You just have to be born.
Well, privilege is intersectional, right? Because white privilege oftentimes is the underlying accomplishment of even education, right? It's the underlying accomplishment of your career, right? You don't actually oftentimes need to do what your fellow students or your
Well, I guess
coworkers.
I'm asking a different question, Frederick.
Mm.
Just being born confers, as Stephen is saying, just by the virtue of his birth, having a white father conferred upon him a certain privilege that didn't matter if he went to school, if he got a degree, if he became a New York Times, a columnist, none of that mattered. Just by virtue of his birth, his DNA, his father. Very
Absolutely.
different than my privilege. I have education privilege. I went
Yeah.
to the University of Chicago and Harvard. If I didn't do that, I would be Black Areva with no education privilege. But I have education privilege. But I don't have Steve's privilege. My father's not white. My mother's not white. So I'm very different. I guess my point is, white privilege doesn't require you to do anything.
No, it doesn't. And white privilege is probably most similar to patriarchal privilege, right? And there's some who have both patriarchal and white privilege. And then they have the last of, if you would, a culture reference, the infinity stones of privilege, right? They're also heterosexual. So again, there's a hierarchy to privilege. And I think that in that hierarchy, being white is the most grandiose thing that you can be. You can be mediocre and I'll give you a good example. As you used with Elizabeth, you were mentioning some of my accolades earlier on. I live next to frankly, a bunch of mediocre white people, right? And that's just the honest truth. And many of these people, when I was moving in my sweatpants and a hoodie, reached out to our management of the place that I lived to ask who I was and what right I had to be moving here, as opposed to
what team did you play? Really want to know what team you were on. That's what they were really asking.
Indeed, right? And
who did you play for? Does he play for the Knicks?
Right, and that's really what it is, right? So being white and oftentimes being a man allows you a certain level of mediocrity versus your counterparts in the same spaces or just in society. The moment that you were born, you have power, privilege, access, resources that the rest of us not only have to work twice as hard for, sometimes we have to literally work 5 times as hard and not ever receive the same things that you have simply for being and existing as you do.
Yeah. We've got to leave it there. Such an interesting conversation. Tell us where we can find this challenge, Frederick. I want everybody to go to the internet and participate in your challenge. Where can they find it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yahoo.com/allyship. I think everyone should do the challenge regardless of what space you occupy in society, because we all have privilege in some way, shape, or form.
All right. Again, it's Frederick Joseph, his New York Times bestselling book, The Black Friend. Get it everywhere books are sold, online and in bookstores. Thank you so much, Frederick and Sandra and Steve, for sharing your stories. Such an important conversation. Obviously, just scraping or scratching the surface of this really big talk, but it's so important that we continue to talk about how we get better. All of us get better. So again, thank you for joining me this morning. All right. Next, I want to bring on Dr. Dibinga. You've seen him on the show. He's been here lots of times. He's a recurring guest. He is a professor of cross-cultural studies at American University. Welcome back, Dr. Dibinga.
Having me. Happy to be here. Always.
We got to start with that women's history trivia question. Who coined the phrase white fragility? Is it Jane Elliott, Peggy McIntosh, or Robin DiAngelo? Help us out, Dr. Dibinga.
Robin DiAngelo. Powerful book, White Fragility.
Okay, Robin is a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author. I think that book stayed on the New York Times best-selling list for over a year.
Yes.
Gained in more prominence after the civil unrest of 2020, the summer. She's a former professor. She has a PhD in multicultural education from the University of Washington. So this book, for some, it's the Bible. It just lays it all out when it talks about white privilege, talks about how white people get defensive when the term is used. She argues that structural racism is not intentional, but a lot of people say, hey, this book is just a bunch of propaganda and it makes white folks responsible and blames them for everything. What do you think, Dr. Dibinga?
I think that it's a very powerful book. I've been working in our school systems for over 20 years, public, private, and charter schools. And I can't tell you how many times I've had situations where a white principal or a white teacher would say that, well, I'm able to say this to my white parents because they're going to receive it a little bit better. Now, for me, I never cared. If I have something on my mind, I'm going to speak it. But there were a lot of other Black teachers and non-white teachers who felt like they couldn't have those conversations unless it came from a white person. And so what Robin is doing in her book, which is incredible, is she's having that conversation with white people. She's talking to them about their proximity to white people. Why are the interactions we have with Black people, I should say, always at a distance? Or why are they stereotypes? She talks about characters like the donkey in Shrek and how, the Black experience that we see is something that we get from television and the like. And quite honestly and unfortunately, there are a lot of white people who are not ready to have that conversation at all, but definitely not with somebody who is not white. And so that's why I think her book is so powerful and why it's a constant presence on the bestsellers list.
Yeah, she uses the phrase white fragility to really describe white people who get defensive,
Yes.
who get defensive when they're questioned about race or they're made to think about, their own privilege. And that's why I think a lot of folks attack her, and she's been criticized. Some folks say again that the book blames white people, but one thing I think is really, really poignant about the book that I love is that she criticizes white liberals and progressives who view themselves as quote unquote woke. And she says that a lot of those people who are trying to be allies or accomplices, as Frederick likes to say, are avoiding any questions about race or their own privileges. And she confronts them on that. And again, in your situation, a professor being in education, have you had those experiences where you're talking to someone who says, look, I get it. I marched, with the protesters. I've been out there with Black Lives Matter. I changed my Instagram account to the Black Squares. I have my Black friends. They got the checklist of, I do all the Black stuff. But you just want to say to them, but wait a minute, it's deeper than
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. And, Frederick Douglass even talked about this, and Dr. King spoke about this, about how the white liberals can be more of a problem than even some of the white racists. And so, yes, I've definitely encountered students who may use this particular language that they feel like they are part of this movement, they are part of the culture. But what happens is they ultimately end up dominating the movement. And that's when it becomes problematic. And that's why I'm actually not a fan of the term allyship or accomplices. I'm more of a proponent of the term partners, because I believe that the term allies, even though I used to use it, it's become a little bit arrogant, right? People, I'm descending here as your ally. And then what happens from there is that people lose their own power. But when you're partners, you're part of the same team. Allies go to the game and cheer for their team, and then they go home. Partners are in the game fighting for that ring because they realize that I'm not free until you are free, and you are not free until I am free. And so we need to get to that point where we're working together, because at the end of the day, we have to do this for each other and not to stroke our own egos. And unfortunately, I do teach students who do believe that to this day. And those are some of the great conversations we have.
I love that you're making that distinction, because you're so right. Someone can be an ally, but do they have skin in the game? That's what we're really talking about. Do you really see that my advancement is inextricably tied to your advancement? That
Right.
We have this intersectionality that, you do better because I do better, and I do better because you do better. The white privilege term, and what do you think about it? Some folks say we should stop using it. White people, some get very defensive because they say, look, I don't have any privilege. I can't get a job. I'm unemployed. I can't live in, a good neighborhood. I may get food stamps. I've had to work hard all my life to get where I am. Nobody's given me anything. And so when they hear the word privilege, they think it somehow goes to merit or something that they've earned. So do you think we could capture more people in this conversation if we found different language?
I don't think so. I don't think we need to find different language. I think that people are always going to find ways to refute things that they just don't want to hear or believe. So before we get to white, the term privilege itself is real. I'm a man. I've experienced a lot of racism as a Black person, but if heaven forbid I experience some form of sexual assault, no one's going to ask what I was wearing. That's male privilege. As a Black person, when I travel overseas with my US passport, I've had a certain type of privilege attached with that. I'm almost treated like a white person in some of the countries that I go to that are majority Black and brown. So privilege is real. It's just that white privilege has been at the center of it for so long because we live in a system that was based off of white privilege. The system of racism that we know is about 600 years old, and it was created to justify slavery. And more to your point, when people say, well, I didn't get any help, I didn't get anything, let's just give the one example of the GI Bill. When soldiers came back from World War II and got access to housing and bank loans and school and education, but Black soldiers didn't get that. So yes, your grandfather and great-grandfather may have worked hard, but they got access to opportunities that my grandparents, your grandparents, could not get. So it's not taking anything away from the hard work that they did, but when it was time for them to reap their rewards, we didn't have access to those same rewards. And that was the case in housing, it was a case of employment, it was a case in our educational system. And so we have to be honest about that. It doesn't take away from your hard work, it just speaks truth to the reality.
And Dr. Dibinga, people will say, yeah, that was my grandfather. He might have gotten that GI Bill, but I went to the bank yesterday and applied for a loan and I got turned down. So I wasn't treated any differently or any better, than the Black person or the brown person. So people find ways to make these, false distinctions that don't mean anything. Jane Elliott, who, is a very well-known, respected anti-racist scholar, talks about unearned benefits. Do you think, I know you just said you don't think the language matters because people will find a way to dispute the language, but she uses unearned benefits. Does that resonate any differently to you than, privilege?
I respect why she does that, and she's been doing this work forever, and she's seen this firsthand. So I'm completely respectful of that term, unearned benefits, and I'm sure she would probably say that even with that, she still experiences a certain level of pushback from people. But unearned benefits, that is real as well, and I think that is a language that should be part of the conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was trying to get Frederick, I was talking to him about this concept of different privilege. So your male privilege, again, nothing that you had anything to do with. That's your parents,
Right.
They got together, had sex, had a baby, and guess what? It was a man.
Mm-hmm.
And white privilege, same thing. DNA just happens. I talk about my education privilege because, I have an Ivy League education. So I have education privilege, but I had to do something for that. If I didn't study, I wouldn't have gotten into college. If I didn't study, I wouldn't have gotten into law school. If I didn't study, I wouldn't have passed the bar. So is it appropriate to talk about these privileges in the same conversation? Because my education privilege is very different than that white privilege.
Well, that takes us right back to what you were saying about Jane Elliott, right? It's unearned privileges versus the earned privileges. You fought for everything that you have today, and that's real. And a lot of people don't want to have that discussion because they are still dealing with their unearned privileges, but they want to speak as if their unearned privileges are just as important and merit-worthy as our earned privileges. And so, yes, that absolutely has to be added to the conversation because they cannot be equated.
Yeah, we've got to leave it there, Dr. Dibinga. Always such enlightening conversations with you. Your voice is so critical on so many issues, particularly this issue of race and privilege. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
All right, we have had a conversation. We have been talking about microaggressions and white privilege and education privilege and earned and unearned benefits. Again, really tough topics. I know my privilege deniers are going to go crazy. They're going to flood my comments on Facebook and on YouTube, and they're going to call me everything but a child of God. They're going to call me a racist. They're going to call my guests racist. It happens every time we have this discussion. But guess what? We're going to keep having it. We're going to keep having it because it's important to have and it's critical to have. And they may not ever admit it. But I just know, I know as well as I know my name is Areva Martin. I know that some of my deniers, my privileged deniers who like to jump up and down about how life has been tough for them as well, they've learned something today. And they will learn even more if they go to Yahoo and they take Frederick Joseph's privilege challenge. Because every time we have this conversation, we get a little bit closer I think, to that racial healing that is so important to all of us, particularly important to me and to my guest today. So thanks for everybody that tuned in. Thank you for hanging in there. Thank you for being willing to think about these really important and controversial and hard conversations that we're having. Some words to live by before I get out. In the famous words of the poet laureate who has stunned the nation with her brilliance and her writing, she's the award-winning author and poet Maya Angelou. She said, "When you know better, you do better." For every white person who ever wanted to understand the psychological impact and trauma caused by racism, and who wants to become a true anti-racist partner, as Dr. Dibinga said, you should run, not walk, but run to your nearest bookstore to buy Frederick Joseph's book. By recounting his own personal stories of pain and humiliation as a kid growing up in a white neighborhood, Frederick's book makes sure you know better. Now it's up to you to do better. I'm out, y'all. Don't forget to wear your mask. Be safe out there. And remember, we are all in this together.